Hello, I'm Jennifer Pratt-Miles from the Meridian Institute. At Meridian, we help people solve problems and find solutions that improve lives, the economy, and the environment. So does the Johnson Foundation. I'm here at Wingspread with Representative Cory Mason to talk about community resilience and the future of Racine and the region. Representative Mason, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
May I call you Cory?
Please.
Great.
Please.
Well, as you may know, the Johnson Foundation has been convening a community conversation about resilience and how to ensure a bright future for the City of Racine and its neighbors. Tell me, what does a resilient community look like from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think resilience, at the very least, allows us, Racine and its neighbors, to withstand the changes that are coming in the century that we live in now. We worked very well under a certain set of circumstances in the 20th century. We're a manufacturing powerhouse and really thrived under those conditions. And we're still a manufacturing hub, but the world has changed. And so the real question becomes, if we're going to be a resilient community, I think it means recognizing our interdependence on one another, acknowledging that to really have success, we need to work together, and that we're actually stronger when we work together as opposed to trying to go it alone, with 7 different communities trying to have its own way. So it's recognizing the interconnectedness that we all have, and then working really well together to be resilient to the changes that are coming with our economy, with education, around healthcare, around infrastructure, all of these things that if we are smart, allow us to not only exist, but actually thrive and succeed.
Thanks. And what kinds of things might you do to make Racine and its neighbors more resilient if you become mayor?
Well, I think the first part is just working to foster better relationships in the community. I think communication is the first piece. And then I think there's some alignment work that the Johnson Foundation's already started that I think needs to be continued and expanded upon, where we sort of look at, okay, well, do we agree that we're all in this together? Are we really going to all work towards common goals to allow the broader community to succeed, or are we not in alignment, and are there different parts of the community who want to go their own way? I think those are things that we really need to address. But in an ideal world, you're finding a way for the broader communities to work together and then align around a vision and a series of plans that aren't just to the benefit of one community versus another, or at the expense of one community or another, but acknowledges our mutual interdependence and says, okay, if we all work together on this, this is how we could compete better with other metro areas that are succeeding in many ways because they've figured some of these challenges out. So I think that there's a real effort that needs to be put forward to acknowledge that we're in this together, to work together towards a set of common goals, and then achieve them. I think really there's at least 3, maybe 4 topics that really will drive this conversation. And not surprisingly, infrastructure around water and transportation play a huge role on this, right? I mean, if each community just sort of looks through its own lens when it comes to transportation options and water and access to water, we're gonna be butting heads quite a bit. But if we sort of acknowledge, we need to move workers and people around the entire region, not just one community at a time, or that all of our communities are going to need access to water for whether it's for industrial use or for residential use or growth. So looking at that, certainly our education system is going to need to be discussed. We've had a unified school district for decades, but there's discussion about stepping back from that, and I think that's a real challenge. There's also discussion around, does it make sense to merge services or not? And what do our boundaries look like? Are the boundaries equitable? Do they make sense maybe they made sense in 1975, but maybe they don't in 2017. And so I think when you put all of those things on the table and have a real honest and frank conversation with the city and its neighbors, there's real potential to move the city forward and the community forward in really positive and exciting ways. But I think you have to sort of look at it, broadly and then specifically to see if there's ways we can align and move forward together.
Okay, so I hear you saying there are 3 areas where you see opportunities for the city and its neighbors to work together: infrastructure and transportation, education, and possibly services.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
great. Let's talk for a minute about leadership.
Sure.
So we've heard of this concept of servant leadership, and I'd be interested to hear how you think about balancing leading versus serving.
I mean, it's really, you have to do both, right? I mean, I think you can never forget that you are serving the people who elected you and their interests, but oftentimes leadership requires people who are elected and hold office to lay out a vision and say, look, this is what we're trying to accomplish together as a community, and building support around it. And really, those things go back and forth. So you can't get so far ahead of your community that you're doing something that's unsustainable, but at the same time, you hear people saying that they're really hoping for more leadership, that people would see a vision that's laid out and have an elected official that would go after that vision and rally people behind it. So I think I don't think it's an either or, I think it's a both and that you really have to try to achieve.
Okay, and I think you've talked about this a little already, but is there anything more that you'd want to say about what your vision is for Racine and the surrounding communities?
Yeah, I mean, so we are in some ways poised to do so much as a broader community. So here we are between Milwaukee and Chicago on the shores of Lake Michigan with an interstate that runs along the western edge of it. I mean, that right there should be, a place where we can find a way to succeed. I mean, there's just enormous potential there. And as Milwaukee and Chicago continue to grow into each other, as industry becomes more and more dependent upon water, which we have access to, and the need for infrastructure, which we have access to, we're really poised to do some incredible things. And strangely, we were so successful in the 20th century with our manufacturing that our geographic position was almost irrelevant, right? So we haven't quite figured out how to really take advantage of where we're located and the advantages that presents. So I think there's just enormous potential for what that looks like moving forward, but that requires a vision to be laid out, consensus to be gained, and a mutual understanding that, and it sounds so simple to say, but I don't think we've yet achieved it, that if we acknowledge that we can achieve more together than we can separately, then there's a lot that we can do. If you look at, neighboring communities, I mean, you just have to drive to Kenosha to see that they've got 3 big municipalities there that all have access to water, that all have access to infrastructure, that have found a way to grow. I'm not saying it's been perfect, but they have found a way for each of those communities to thrive. And I think here, we're still struggling to find our way about, what do these communities look like? What are their visions? What do they want to be? Do they want to be industrial? Do they want to be rural? Do they want to be residential? What are their goals? And I still think we're trying to figure that out, which is why the conversation about not just resilience, but cooperation and a common vision is really important.
And this region is on the cusp of a major economic development. How do you think Racine can maximize the benefits of that?
Yeah, so biggest employment announcement certainly in my lifetime, right? And so we've talked about, we were, this powerhouse in the 20th century. How do we regain sort of being a place where, a big new exciting manufacturer would be based here? And that's what we're indeed on the cusp of. For Racine, there's a number of things that come into play. The first of which is it will almost certainly require some conversation about expanding the city's water utility closer to the interstate. So there's a conversation right there to be had where the city is going to need to talk with its neighbors about what infrastructure looks like. More exciting to me, though, is just this discussion about what it potentially means for workers. I've been elected an official for 11 years. I've been knocking on doors for 12. And I can tell you over the time, what I've heard more than anything is, when are good paying jobs coming back, right? I mean, people really long for the economic security that was more prominent in the 80s and even 90s. That's harder to find. I had one guy tell me who, he has a job where he makes okay money, but he has no benefits and no pension. And he said, I would do anything for the factory job with the wages and the benefits that I had in the 90s today. And so for a lot of people, they don't have the same economic security. So with the employer, Foxconn, they're talking about 10,000 people that are going to be needed to build it, potentially 13,000 people to work there, plus whatever supply chain might come along. That's an enormous possibility, but we will only really be able to take advantage of it if we get people trained to do that work.
Okay.
Right? So there are not 10,000 unemployed construction workers sitting in Racine just waiting for someone to come, right? But there are opportunities to train people to get into the building trades to build that facility. Similarly, we don't have, thousands of unemployed engineers just waiting for someone to come along. But we know it's going to be a couple years before it opens, so that creates an enormous opportunity for the city to partner with Gateway and Parkside and other partners to get people trained in a 1 or 2 year degree so that they'd be qualified to work there. So really, one of the most important things that the next mayor is going to really have to focus on is, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but we really have to seize it, right? You really have to be intentional about, how are we going to get workers trained? How do we find those workers? How do we encourage those workers? Because if we don't seize this moment, then it might as well be 100 miles away instead of 5 miles away from the city. We really need to figure that out. And then there's going to be, we don't have good transportation to and from the interstate. We're going to have to talk about that. And the other amazing opportunity that the city gets is, there will be some people who want to live out in the country and be near the interstate because that's what they would prefer. But I like the opportunity of being able to say to thousands of workers who might be coming to the area, look, come live here. We have a beautiful lakefront. We have one of the best beaches in North America. We've got an underappreciated riverfront that's about to be redeveloped. There's enormous opportunities there, but you can't really fully redevelop if the market's not there to do it. Well, with potentially thousands of people moving to the area to work there, there's a real opportunity to create spaces for those workers to live. So it's really, even though the development itself won't occur in the city of Racine,
Right.
there's enormous opportunities for the city if we seize them. And I think it's going to take leadership and ambition and a whole lot of work to really seize that opportunity.
And do you see some of what you're talking about, the training, looking out a couple of years, do you see those as opportunities to benefit some of Racine's least advantaged population?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, for too long, Racine, the city, has unfortunately had this distinction of being first or second in unemployment in the state of Wisconsin. Certainly for the 11 years that I've been in office, and before that as well. Really, when manufacturing took big downturns, it really hit us hard. And so here's what I know about people in Racine, that they work hard, that they really take pride in their work, and that if you give them the skills and the opportunity, they will succeed. There just haven't been the same kind of opportunities. And so here, if you can retrain or train people to be ready to take on this opportunity to help build a facility or help work at a facility, can really make a big difference. But there's no disputing that there's a workforce training and education component that we have to seize and get ready of. I think, so part of it's making sure that as many people who are here can take advantage of the opportunity, and then also acknowledging that some people will move here, and so how do we recruit them to want to be in our city?
Now, you mentioned unemployment, and I know a lot of people are thinking about some of the challenges that are facing Racine. We've talked about there are these great opportunities on the horizon, but it'd be helpful to hear your thoughts about how some of those challenges could be addressed. So maybe let's start with unemployment and poverty. Yeah,
so I mean, I would say unemployment and underemployment go hand in hand. I mean, because there's there are people who are working but still living in poverty, and that's unfortunately more and more frequent these days. So there's a couple things to think about it. In the city of Racine, there's somewhere, depending upon which statistics you look at, there's between 9 and 11,000 people age 25 or older with no high school diploma or GED, right? So it's an enormous barrier to employment just right there for adults who, for whatever reason, don't have a high school diploma or GED. So part of getting at this is, how do we get people educated? The statistics on people unemployed or underemployed without a diploma versus with a diploma is huge. But it also requires significant dedication to finding people to get into the trades or to get a 2-year associate's degree. So 10 years ago, they started rebuilding the interstate in Racine and Kenosha. And the state and federal government put together a labor development committee that was designed to encourage people who lived in the communities that the interstate was being rebuilt in to do that work. And it was an order of magnitude that was really stunning. So we did a job fair, and several thousand people came to the job fair, and we said, look, to get ready to work in the trades, you have to take this 6-week class and make sure you have a valid driver's license, and that you can do a 10th grade math test and pass a drug test. And by the time you got through the number of people who would take the test and pass it and go through the 6-week course, you went from several thousand people who were interested enough to show up to about 100 people who graduated, right? And that was great for the 100 people, and we worked really hard to get those 100 people ready. But then there's 100 other people who were interested enough to show up and ask about, how do I get a job, but didn't have the skills or couldn't take a 6-week course, maybe because they were working or had other limitations. So we have to really be mindful about meeting the workforce where it is and getting them ready to build the facility and work at the facility. And to be clear, it's not just the employer coming here, right? They're going to expand the interstate because of that. That's probably $500 million worth of work that'll happen on the interstate. There's the water utility work that'll need to be done. There's they've been talking an awful lot about supply chain. There's potentially a lot of work to be done in Racine. And again, that's going to require a commitment of meeting the workforce where it is, and then also working with kids who are in high school now and getting them specifically thinking about, have you thought about going to the building trades? Have you thought about being an industrial engineer? Because there's enormous opportunities that are coming down the pike. So we just really have to be intentional about all of it. We have to work in collaboration with the county and Gateway and Parkside and the other institutions that are nearby, and just really be deliberate about it. And I have real enthusiasm and excitement that with the opportunity we can do it, but it won't just happen by itself. It will require a lot of intention and a lot of collaboration. But I know from talking to people in Racine for a long time, they just want the dignity of a good paying job. And if you give them the opportunity and the training to get it, they'll meet those goals and even exceed them.
Great. One of the other challenges that I've heard people talking about for the city is high taxes and high cost of services. What are your thoughts about some ways to address those issues?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think collaboration and discussions with our neighbors can be extremely helpful. So, I mean, there are a number of assets that the city has, that the broader community uses, where the city pays a heavier share around services and facilities that the broader community uses. And it's no doubt a challenge when you have most of the wealth in the community outside of the city. When you equalize the property values for it, that has a long-term effect. There's no doubt about it. But it's also a real opportunity. I mean, I don't think we want to proceed where we're basically saying, look, the communities that are most challenged, we just want to keep them in one community and not figure out how we're jointly going to address these issues. But certainly better collaboration would mean better equalized values and lower tax rates if we're smart about it. But I think the challenge for the city and the surrounding communities when we engage in these conversations are really going to come down to, well, is this a benefit? Can we do this in a way where it's a win-win for everyone, right? Like, so, if we're going to go in a direction that helps surrounding villages on one thing, then the city needs to be able to say to the surrounding villages, well, then we need help on these other things. So it's really important that it's looked at holistically. But I think the broader we can collaborate, the more it's going to keep costs down and keep taxes at a place where they're sustainable. But there's no, the city has roughly an $80-some million budget, and despite the property tax rate where it is, that still accounts for about a third of the budget, right? So the rest of it comes from federal and state and other sources. And so the other thing that we really need to think about as a community is, how do we talk to our state and federal partners that have really straitjacketed older cities like Racine and cut funding sources, and say to them, like, look, when you do this puts real pressure on our property tax base. And if you want us to flourish, we really need our help from our state and federal partners that have scaled that back. So there's a lot of work to do there locally, but certainly with our state and federal partners too, and getting them to understand the value of investing in cities the way they do in other communities.
So, you've mentioned collaboration a couple of times, and that's one of the things that we heard from some of the experts who came and spoke at the Johnson Foundation's Resilient Communities briefing series back in June, that intergovernmental cooperation is really key to resilient communities. When you hear that term, intergovernmental cooperation, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it sounds like such a wonky term.
What does it look like?
Such a policy term. It can, we already do it in some ways, right? We have a unified school district, right? And so you have 7 communities sending their children to the same school district. And so that works and has worked very well for decades. You've got a water utility that serves all or most of those 7 communities, and they've written agreements on the terms and conditions about how those work. It basically just acknowledges that there are some things that we can do jointly, and if we do, what does that look like? What does that agreement look like? Is it fair for everybody, or isn't it? It's really easy to get, have your eyes gloss over about, the details of it, or the specifics of it, or how many millions of gallons per day versus, intergovernmental funds and what that means and what the investment is. But at the end of the day, despite all the policy details of it, you need to ask, is it a good deal for all the municipalities involved? And does it help move the individual communities forward and the broader community forward? And those should really guide those kind of agreements moving forward. Because you can have agreements, but if they're not mutually beneficial, it makes it hard to move the region forward. But if you're willing to have conversations that can be mutually beneficial for everyone, not only do the individual communities benefit, but the whole region benefits, because we're able to compete with other regions that have done this collaboration a long time ago.
So I'm hearing you talk about a vision for Racine's relationship with its neighbors that involves collaboration and finding solutions that are going to be mutually beneficial. How do you start that conversation?
Yeah, first you start with communication, right? You just need to, I think Racine and its neighbors need to meet regularly. They're different sizes and shapes and populations and geographies. They have different assets and liabilities. And so you have to start with communication and hopefully have good and not adversarial relationships. You have to at least start there. You have to communicate before you can start to collaborate. And then I think, ideally you're going to let good data, if you can agree to sort of the principles of let's find things that are mutually beneficial, then you let good data sort of drive the conversation. And I think you have to do it in a way where you're putting everything on the table, so you're not just sort of looking at things in silos. Like, if you just have a conversation about, say, fire service, but don't also have a conversation about water service, you're really missing the broader picture about,
because they're all interrelated.
They're all interrelated. And so, sort of putting everything out there of like, so what does this mean for education service, for for transportation services? What does this mean for water infrastructure? And what does it mean for basic municipal services? Does it make sense to do this jointly, or does it not? Or if we're putting it forward, is there a way to do it that, again, is mutually beneficial for everyone and not done in such a way where it disadvantages one community long-term over the others?
What do you think are some of the obstacles that have prevented local governments from working together in the past?
I mean, many of these things
And
are...
how could those be overcome?
Right, many of these things are, literally some of these conversations are about, well, I remember in the 1960s when this group decided to do that with this group. These are fights from before I was born, right? So I think part of it is, we should be informed by our past, but we shouldn't be so caught up in what happened in 1960 whatever that we can't find a way to work together and move forward. So I think part of it is just letting some old grudges go. But I think it's as much, the communities are all in different places at different times, and they have different leaders with different styles who have had different views on collaboration. And so I think, again, it's why assembling people and having a robust conversation about, so what are all the issues? And can we find a way to do something that's mutually beneficial? And so I think part of it's putting all the cards on the table, and then I think it's doing some homework. I think if you look at similarly sized communities and see how they've managed to work together and how they're flourishing because of it, and compare them to communities that are fractured and want to do their own thing, you hope that everybody sort of reaches the conclusion that, we would actually be stronger if we all worked together than if we tried to go our own way and do it alone. And that's really the challenge and the opportunity that exists there. But it requires us all coming together, us all having conversations, and we're not going to agree on everything, right? Different communities have different interests, but where we can agree and where we can find a common vision, I'm someone who believes that the City of Racine and all of its neighbors will flourish and do better economically, educationally, on just about any measure you can imagine, on transportation, on healthcare, on any of those things, that those are all improved if we're working together than if we are trying to go it alone and fixed on what boundaries looked like in 1975 or who got water in 1967 or all these things that you hear people talk about why things are where they are now. That's good information to have, but that shouldn't be a stumbling block or an obstacle that we can't overcome about, okay, well, the past is the past and it's good for us to know that, but how do we all work forward now? Because the communities that are working together, they're winning, right? They're growing economically. They're achieving the 21st century. And I think we're still trying to figure out that we're going to need to rely on one another, that we're going to have to cooperate. And if we can figure out, those lessons, we'll all be stronger for it.
Yeah. So building on that, we were talking earlier about some of the challenges facing the city, and I think some of the folks who live in Caledonia, Mount Pleasant, Sturtevant, have concerns about some of the challenges that are facing the city. What do you say to those folks about why should they care about what happens in Racine? What's in it for them to work together with the city?
Yeah, what's in it for them is if we have a strong, thriving community, everybody moves ahead. It's interesting. There are some people who are very partisan to their municipality, right? It's sort of like, I only care about what happens in my neck of the woods or my corner of this community. But I talk to just as many people who see themselves as part of a broader community and see, people barely know where the boundaries are. I've actually had some very nice people who are just like, I guess I live in Mount Pleasant. Can I vote for you for mayor? I'm like, no, you have to live in the city, which in some ways seems a bit silly, but on the other hand, what it means is a lot of people see themselves as part of a broader community and want to see it succeed. So there are very real challenges that exist. They won't be overcome by simply saying, well, any of the challenges that the broader community has, let's just give those to the city to deal with, and we'll be out here on our own, and everything will be just fine. It's just it's not a realistic view of how of how any of the communities are going to grow, and there's simply no scenario. And this isn't just my opinion. There's data that if you look at other communities where, if you have one municipality that just continues to persist with high levels of poverty and unemployment, it's not like the surrounding suburbs then suddenly flourish because all those issues have been segregated into one community, and there's just not a scenario where that's overcome. And so I think what everyone wants to realize is like, hey, look, if you want your property values to remain relatively low and your services to be better, and for us to have better outcomes where we're competing better with Oak Creek or Kenosha or Zion or wherever it is that we're competing with, they're all working together. And so that's the real fact that people have to wrestle with. And it's part of that, you were talking about the service versus leading part. Part of the leadership is trying to get, I think, the broader community to realize, look, we have a shared future together. Whether you like that or not, we do. And so if we're going to achieve the middle class for this next generation, and I believe that we can, we're far more likely to be successful in Racine, but also in Caledonia and Sturtevant and Mount Pleasant and Wind Point and North Bay, if we're all in it together and working on it together. So I think that's one of the first things that we might have to come to terms with, but that's where leadership is so important. You've got to provide that vision and get people to understand that we're in this together, and we'll either achieve the middle class together, or we'll be doomed to be fighting these same fights, many of which are decades old. I think people are ready for change and a new kind of leadership that finds a way where we can not only have the city succeed, but the broader community succeed as well.
Great. You've mentioned education a couple of times, and I'm wondering what role, if any, do you think the next mayor should play in helping to determine the future of the Racine Unified School District?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I'm a graduate of Racine Unified Schools. Okay. My children go to Racine Unified Schools. If I'm any value of a public servant, it's because of the education I got in Racine Public Schools. And that's true for lots of reasons, but two that I'll just mention. I got great academics. I went to fine arts for elementary school, and then got to go to Walden for middle school, and then a great program at Case. They had one of the first high schools in the state to have the International Baccalaureate program. Okay. And so I got a great education in Racine academically, but I also got to go to school with a diverse group of kids that look like the real world, that really reflect what society looks like. And it wasn't until I moved away that I really came to appreciate that, wow, not everybody had that opportunity. And so I think that's one of the greatest strengths that Racine Unified has. I strongly believe that our children get a good education in Racine schools. But poverty has been on the rise, and as poverty comes into our schools, it does affect student achievement. So as mayor, I have no interest in trying to take over schools or start my own schools or be in place of schools, but I do have a real interest in trying to figure out, there's 1,000 kids roughly every year in Racine Unified who are homeless for all or part of the year out of 20,000 kids, wow. Right? Well, I need to allow those teachers and educators in the schools to teach them during the day, but if I'm mayor and I really want to help, I don't need to try to take over the curriculum. I need to figure out, well, why are so many kids homeless, and what kind of support can we offer to them and to their parents to give them more stability, so that when kids come to school, they're thinking about learning and not, where am I going to go home tonight? Where's my next meal going to come from? And that's really what the next mayor needs to think about. And frankly, it's what policymakers from across the region need to sort of appreciate. If you want to do something real about improving disparities in education, then let's work together in a real way about addressing the needs of kids in poverty, because it's been increasing and it has a real impact on how kids learn. And there's certainly room to talk about better ways to educate kids, and I think what NAP School has done with their community school model. I'm a very big fan of. It's a new school in a high poverty community, and they partnered with United Way to put a community school in there so that they're working with the kids and their families about, what are the issues that you're facing right now? What causes a lack of stability that might impact student learning? And even after a year, you're seeing less truancy and better student achievement academically. So those are the kind of things that I think a mayor can be mindful of doing, and finding a way to support the schools and support the kids and the families that go to the schools, and letting the school district have a successful curriculum.
Mm-hmm. So shifting gears a little bit from talking about the city's youngest residents to the fact that this is a region with an aging population,
Mm-hmm.
and some would say that it's suffering a brain drain. And it's also a place where many workers don't live in the city.
Right.
So what can the mayor do that would better engage the younger residents and those workers who don't live within the city limits to become more actively engaged in the community and its future?
Yeah, well, the first thing you can do is, I think, do a better pitch of trying to get people to live in the city.
Okay.
I think there's a feeling, for whatever reason, that, well, I might go work in the city, but I don't see that as a place where I would want to live. Mm-hmm. And really, one of the things that I think the next mayor needs to think about is, we are really lucky to have a lot of seniors who live in town who have a real benefit that they offer to the community, and we should value and continue to find services to support them. But at the same time, what are we doing to recruit young families to want to live here, and not just work here, but live here? My wife and I have an 8, 7, and 5-year-old, and so we, interact with other parents who have kids who live in Racine, and they love it here. They feel like there's a lot of opportunity, and we're right on Lake Michigan, and we've got a fantastic zoo, we've got a great library, we've got wonderful things to do in this community. But for whatever reason, people don't always see that. And so I think showing people those professional families that are just getting started, that Racine has some great assets and some more affordable assets compared to neighboring communities. I think there's a real way to recruit young families to want to live in the city. And part of that is, improving some of the choices that exist with housing and really getting at poverty and worker training. But part of it is just explaining to people how valuable the city is and what a resource it is. It's a great city. I love it. I think when people get to know it and see what we have to offer, they'll give it another look. I know certainly the young families that live here that we know love it, but it's sort of like, I didn't realize until I got here all the great things that the city has to offer. And so I think we have to do a better job of explaining that to people and selling that to people and really showing them what we have here.
Cory, both you and your fellow candidate have had experience being in the minority on some really important public issues.
Yeah.
What have you learned from that experience about how to collaborate and how to bring people with diverse perspectives together to find win-win solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the last 7 years, I've been in the minority, and it's not my preferred place to be, right? It's easier if you've got a majority of people who agree with you on most things, and there are things that the Republicans have done. Well, we could do a whole other thing on the last few years.
That'll be the next podcast.
Right, but you have two choices when you're in that situation. You can become bitter about that and feel like, well, I'm not getting anything done, and this isn't going my way, and so I just I'm going to lash out about what that is. Or you can recognize that, on most big things, we don't agree. But if you're a good public servant, you have to set your personal feelings aside and ask yourself, well, are there places where we can agree and get things done from time to time for the good of our community? So, believe it or not, this last legislative session was my most successful legislative session to date, even though I was in the minority. And part of that was spending the time of learning the lessons, like, okay, well, they're probably not going to agree with me about raising the minimum wage. And that's unfortunate. But I found a way to work with Senator Darling on an organ donor bill to make it easier for people to donate organs. I worked with a Republican from Spring Green, Wisconsin, to establish a Frank Lloyd Wright Trail from Racine up to Milwaukee through Madison and then up to Spring Green to celebrate Frank Lloyd Wright and his heritage here. Those are the things that you learn how to do after a time, and even with the most severe disagreements that you might have with your political opponents from time to time, if you're really in it for the public service, you have to put those feelings aside. And it doesn't mean you're giving up your values or what you believe in. You're going to live to fight another day. But it shouldn't become so acrimonious and so personal that you can't still find a way, when you can mutually agree on something, to do something good to move the community forward.
Well, Cory, it has been great talking with you about the upcoming election, community resilience, and the future of Racine and its neighboring communities. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. This is great.